In the middle of the largest deal announcement of the decade, billionaire CEO Celeste Kingsley pointed across the crowded room at Nolan Pierce, a single father in a twice-altered suit, and called him worthless in front of every investor, banker, and executive in the building. Nolan did not argue. He placed a stamped folder on the table, asked her one quiet question about whether she was certain she wanted to sign, and walked into the hallway to make a single phone call. 9 minutes later, the screens turned red. 40 banks suspended credit, locked the collateral accounts, and froze the billion-dollar acquisition. But what truly frightened Celeste was not the money. If you appreciate stories where quiet strength finally speaks, subscribe and stay with this one all the way to the end. Nolan Pierce arrived at Kingsley Dominion Group headquarters on a gray Tuesday morning carrying a worn leather bag, a stainless thermos, and a temporary badge that read Contract Document Reviewer, Archives. He took the elevator not to the polished executive floors above, but to the basement level, where fluorescent lights hummed over rows of filing cabinets and the air carried the faint smell of decisions long filed and forgotten. Nobody on the upper floors thought to ask who he was or what exactly he was searching for, because people who worked in the archives existed at Kingsley Dominion in the same category as the heating system: essential, unseen, and never invited to meetings. His colleagues in that lower level treated him with the particular brand of condescension reserved for men who appeared to have either peaked too early or fallen from somewhere they should have stayed. They noted the aging suit, the outdated phone, and the plain lunch container he brought each morning from home, and they drew their conclusions quickly, the way people always do when they mistake stillness for limitation. One mid-level manager had remarked, loudly enough for the whole floor to hear, that a man past 40 doing the work of a junior intern had clearly failed at something important somewhere along the way. Nolan heard the remark, said nothing, and turned back to the document in front of him at exactly the pace of someone who already knew what they were looking for. The files he had been reviewing for the past 2 weeks all pointed toward a single transaction: Kingsley Dominion's proposed acquisition of Westbridge Infrastructure, a deal that would give Celeste Kingsley control over the largest privately held network of logistics hubs, data centers, and industrial land on the eastern seaboard. The acquisition was structured around a syndicated credit facility that had assembled 40 of the nation's most powerful financial institutions into a single lending consortium, a construction of interlocking agreements set to close before the market opened the following morning. On the surface, the paperwork was meticulous, stamped, formatted, and filed in exactly the sequence that regulators required. But Nolan had spent enough years building the systems that governed such paperwork to understand that a clean surface could be laid carefully over a fractured floor. On his third day of review, he identified 3 separate properties appearing in different collateral portfolios under different identification codes, each presented to a different lender as a unique asset, though the legal descriptions and site coordinates were unmistakably identical across all 3. He cross-referenced the discrepancy against the Master Covenant document and found Clause 17.4, a provision he recognized not because he had studied it in those archives, but because he had written the original language himself years earlier for an entirely different purpose. The digital signature attached to the amended version of that clause had been altered in a way nearly impossible to detect unless one already knew the original fingerprint, and Nolan noted the difference in a small notebook before quietly replacing the folder in its drawer. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table of a modest house 30 minutes outside of downtown and listened to his daughter Sophie describe a history project about systems that looked stable from the outside but collapsed because of a single hidden flaw. And he asked her the right questions and laughed at the right moments, and if she noticed that her father was somewhere else behind his eyes, she did not press him on it. She asked whether he missed the work he used to do before he started coming home for dinner every night, and he said he did not miss it the way she might imagine, that what mattered about a thing was not the size of it, but whether it kept the right people safe. Sophie said that sounded like something he would put on a wall, and he laughed again, and the weight behind his eyes did not lift entirely, but it shifted slightly. The way a difficult thing shifts when someone you love briefly makes it feel smaller than it is. He was back at his desk before sunrise the following morning, and the request he submitted for a direct meeting with Celeste Kingsley was intercepted before it ever reached her office by Preston Harrow, who marked it as internal noise, filed it in a folder that no one would open, and gave it no further thought. The announcement event for the Westbridge acquisition had been designed to be remembered. A grand ballroom in a downtown tower, chandeliers overhead, and a guest list that included the chairmen of 4 major pension funds, the presidents of 3 regional banks, and enough press to ensure that by morning the story would be on the front page of every financial publication in the country. Celeste Kingsley had spent 3 years engineering this moment, and as she stood before her board of directors the afternoon before the event, she made clear that the transaction would close before the market opened, regardless of whatever final details remained outstanding. Preston Harrow presented the financing summary with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed it, confirming that all 40 lending participants had approved their respective tranches, that the collateral certifications were complete, and that the drawdown account was positioned to receive the first disbursement within hours of the signing. And he omitted entirely the 3 memoranda Nolan had submitted to the document oversight queue over the preceding week, each flagging the same collateral irregularities from a different angle, because Preston had concluded that a temporary archive reviewer raising questions about documents he was not authorized to fully understand posed less risk if his concerns simply disappeared into a folder that no one would open. What Preston had not shared with Celeste was the structure he had discovered could be exploited through a company called Red Hollow Holdings, which appeared in the Kingsley Dominion filings as an independent real estate partner but was not independent at all. Red Hollow's operating account received capital from a Kingsley subsidiary, deployed it into property transactions, and then returned proceeds to a personal investment vehicle that Preston controlled through 2 intermediate entities registered in Delaware, making the round trip nearly invisible to anyone who was not looking at the right ledger. Nolan had traced the same structure from the archive documents and understood immediately that Red Hollow was not a counterparty but a mirror, designed to let the same assets appear in multiple places simultaneously. He took the elevator to the 22nd floor that afternoon and waited outside Preston's office. And when Preston emerged and saw the temporary badge hanging from Nolan's collar, his expression shifted from surprise to something resembling amusement. Nolan said only that he had found something in the collateral stack that required pausing the signing, that he was asking for a brief internal audit before the closing, and that he was extending the courtesy of this conversation before escalating through other channels. Preston looked at the badge, looked at the plain folder, and smiled the way powerful men smile when they believe they are speaking to someone with no power at all, and told him that a man who filed papers in the basement did not have the standing to question the decisions of people managing more capital than he would ever see in his lifetime. By the time Nolan returned to the archive floor, his system credentials had been suspended, and a building security officer was waiting to inform him that his access would be restricted to the lobby level following the closing ceremony the following evening. Nolan accepted the information without protest because what Preston did not know, what no one in that building had thought to verify, was that Nolan had already created a legally authenticated copy of every relevant document and transmitted it to an external oversight repository before his account was locked, and that Eleanor Whitcomb at Whitcomb National Bank had already received a package bearing a digital signature she recognized from years earlier, a signature that had caused her to clear 3 meetings from her afternoon and keep her phone within reach. On the evening of the announcement, Nolan arrived at the grand ballroom in his twice-altered suit, carrying a folder bearing a red certification stamp, having used a standard audit observer authorization to enter through a side corridor that event coordinators had not thought to restrict. The room was everything the occasion demanded. Long tables dressed in white linen, crystal catching light from the chandeliers, the kind of assembled wealth that moves markets and restructures cities, and Nolan moved through it at the measured pace of someone who had once been entirely comfortable in rooms exactly like this one. Several senior directors recognized him as the archivist from the lower floor and moved deliberately to the far side of the room. One of them quietly instructed an event coordinator to redirect him toward the service corridor, assuming he had been sent to deliver materials that belonged at the staff table, and Nolan did not correct the assumption. He moved steadily toward the front of the room, where Celeste Kingsley was preparing to sign the final certification documents that would legally confirm all representations made to the lending consortium, and he placed the red-stamped folder on the table before her, asked her to pause, and said in a voice calibrated to carry to the people immediately surrounding her, but not to the room at large, that 32 assets in the collateral package had been appraised twice under different identification codes, that 8 properties had been pledged as security to multiple lenders simultaneously, and that 1 audit certification bore a signature that could not belong to the person named. Celeste looked at the folder, and then at Nolan, the badge, the suit, the complete absence of the kind of authority she recognized, and concluded with the speed of a woman who had learned to assess risk quickly that this was either a misguided employee seeking attention or someone attempting a clumsy extraction from the moment. Preston materialized at Celeste's shoulder within seconds and spoke first, addressing the people nearby with the tone of a man managing a familiar disruption, saying that Nolan was a contract archivist with a history of grievances, that he had submitted multiple requests for reclassification and salary adjustment that had not been approved, and that his presence was an unauthorized intrusion designed to create exactly this kind of disturbance. The accusation was constructed just precisely enough to be credible to people with no reason to verify it, and Nolan watched several guests step back and recalibrate their expressions toward skepticism. He did not dispute the account. He turned to Celeste and asked her one final time, directly and without raising his voice, whether she was certain she wanted to sign a document personally certifying that all assets in the collateral package were legitimately and singly pledged. Celeste looked around the room at the cameras, at the rows of investors who had traveled for this moment, at the bankers and the staff and the people whose opinions she had spent her entire adult life managing, and calculated that allowing a man in an aging suit to slow her down in front of all of them was a far greater humiliation than whatever concern he was actually raising. She reached for the pen, and the room leaned forward, and Nolan stopped speaking and simply waited. What happened next was not an argument. It was a performance, staged by a woman who had learned that public certainty was its own form of authority, and that the fastest way to neutralize a threat was to make the room laugh at it before anyone had time to think. Celeste asked Nolan, in a voice pitched now to carry across the ballroom, what his hourly rate was, then answered her own question by observing that a single one of her cufflinks had cost more than a month of his earnings, and that her time in this room was worth more per minute than most people earned in a year. She said he had no credentials, no title, and no record of having managed anything of real consequence. That a man who could not hold a career together across 4 decades had disqualified himself from instructing someone who had built an empire in less time. That Kingsley Dominion had not survived 20 years by entertaining the objections of people who sorted papers in the basement, and that the transaction would proceed because 40 institutions had reviewed and approved it, and none of them had found it necessary to send a temporary employee to stop it. The people closest to the front of the room smiled, and 2 of them laughed outright, and Preston stepped forward and asked an event coordinator to remove the chair placed at the nearest table for Nolan, underlining without words that his presence in this configuration was an error of logistics rather than a standing invitation. Nolan noted each face that laughed and filed the information quietly behind his eyes. He made one more attempt, patient, unhurried, without raising his voice, explaining that Celeste's signature on the certification document would activate a personal attestation clause, meaning the legal weight of every misrepresentation in the underlying filings would attach directly to her as the signing officer rather than dispersing through the corporation. Celeste picked up the pen while he was still speaking, signed her name across the certification line in a single unhurried motion, and then pushed the entire folder off the edge of the table so that it fell to the floor at Nolan's feet. She said, with the flat finality of someone who considers a matter closed, that he was not an auditor, not a bank officer, and not a person with standing to occupy any meaningful position in a room like this one, that he had no power here, no authority here, and no value here, and that she expected security to escort him out before the formal toasts began. Nolan crouched and gathered the pages from the floor without hurry, and when he straightened and met her eyes, his expression had not changed. Not toward anger, not toward defeat, not toward the wounded dignity she expected to see on the face of a man who had just been dismissed in public. He said only that in 9 minutes she would understand whose room this actually was. Celeste turned away before he finished the sentence. 2 security officers flanked him, and he walked with them toward the corridor without resistance, and the laughter from the front of the room had already begun to fade back into celebration. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet, lit by sconce lighting that cast everything in warm amber that had no relationship to what was about to happen. Nolan thanked the security officers calmly, told them he would wait in the corridor, and as they exchanged uncertain looks and stepped back toward the doors, he retrieved a second phone from the inside pocket of his jacket. Not the outdated model everyone had noticed, but a plain device kept for a single purpose, and dialed a number that rang once before it was answered. Eleanor Whitcomb said his name the way people say the name of someone they have been waiting to hear from, with the particular steadiness of a person who has already reviewed the documents and is ready to move the moment she receives authorization. Nolan confirmed 3 things, in the order they needed to be heard: that there were assets pledged simultaneously to multiple lenders, that a shell company was being used to obscure beneficial ownership, and that the CEO of Kingsley Dominion had just signed a personal certification attesting to the accuracy of those representations after being warned directly and explicitly. Eleanor asked whether he was certain he wanted to activate Clause 17.4, because once the material violation notice was distributed, she could not recall it, and no member of the consortium would be permitted to continue advancing funds until an independent audit had cleared each underlying asset. Nolan was quiet for a moment that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Through the glass panels beside the corridor door, he could see Celeste holding a champagne glass, surrounded by people already congratulating her on a deal that had not yet been completed. He said, "Activate the emergency audit protocol. Protect the operating deposits and the payroll accounts and the customer escrow balances, and lock every tranche of capital tied to the acquisition." The transmission from Whitcomb National Bank to the other 39 institutions in the consortium took less than a minute, because Eleanor had prepared for this possibility from the moment she received Nolan's authenticated package the previous afternoon. Inside the ballroom, the first sign appeared as a small amber icon in the corner of the event display that no one noticed immediately, and then the screens changed entirely, the champagne glasses stopped moving, and the room shifted into the particular silence that falls when people very accustomed to controlling things suddenly understand that something is happening beyond their control. The first confirmation arrived from the lead disbursement account. A transfer of $2.4 billion in initial acquisition funds had entered a mandatory review hold. The collateral escrow accounts were simultaneously locked across all 40 institutions, meaning no draw or release could be executed without written authorization from the Independent Audit Committee. The operational credit line funding Kingsley Dominion's daily logistics network, the account that kept the lights on in 38 facilities across 14 states, was flagged for suspension pending collateral re-verification. Preston Harrow's phone began to vibrate against the table, and he reached to silence it. But Celeste had already seen the color leave his face, and she had already turned toward the screen, and the room was already becoming something else entirely. 9 minutes after the call ended, the large presentation screen behind the event stage cleared and displayed a single notification framed in red. Credit facilities suspended. Material covenant review. Celeste's first response was the response of a woman who had spent 2 decades solving problems through the force of her own authority, and she directed Preston to contact each of the 40 institutions individually and explain the system's mismatch in the overnight processing queue that had clearly triggered an erroneous lockout. Preston made 4 calls before returning to her side with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man discovering that the mechanism he believed he had set for someone else had closed around his own leg. Every institution had given the same answer. The file lock had been initiated through the independent collateral guarantor on the syndicated facility, and no member of the consortium was authorized to override or defer it without the written consent of that same guarantor. Celeste called Eleanor Whitcomb directly, deploying the particular confidence that had moved regulators and reversed board votes and changed the minds of men who believed they had already decided, and Eleanor listened to everything before responding with the calm of someone insulated from precisely this kind of pressure. The decision, she said, was no longer within the bank's discretion to modify because it had been made by the party bearing the first layer of risk on the entire facility, and that party held the contractual right to exercise this authority independently of Celeste's preferences, her timeline, or the event in progress behind her. Celeste asked who that party was. Eleanor said his name. And then the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Nolan walked back into the room without a security escort, because no one moved to stop him, because the landscape of the room had changed in a way everyone could feel, even if they could not yet describe it. He was followed by a video connection opened on 2 monitors at the side of the stage, through which Audrey Lane and 4 colleagues from the consortium's independent legal team appeared with the professionally composed expressions of people about to say things that would be quoted in regulatory filings for years. Audrey confirmed, clearly and without qualification, that Nolan Pierce was the founding trustee of Cedar Gate Guarantee Trust, the independent guarantee vehicle providing first loss coverage on the syndicated credit facility assembled for the Westbridge acquisition. That Cedar Gate had borne the initial risk layer since the facility was structured 3 years prior. That his signature appeared on the intercreditor agreement Celeste Kingsley had signed at that time, and that without Cedar Gate's participation in the guarantee structure, Kingsley Dominion would not have met the creditworthiness threshold required to access $11.8 billion in syndicated capital. The people in the room who had laughed at Nolan began studying the tablecloths. One director who had directed him toward the service corridor earlier in the evening removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. A senior representative from one of the participating banks asked how a person of Nolan's standing had come to work under the archive floor, and Nolan said he had come to verify anomalies that Preston had repeatedly declined to escalate, and that the 40 institutions had found those anomalies serious enough to require an emergency review, not to destroy Kingsley Dominion, but to protect the retirement funds, customer deposits, and operating capital of tens of thousands of people who had nothing to do with the decisions being made in that room. Celeste stood very still, because she had just understood that she had called the person holding the financial foundation of her empire a worthless man and instructed security to remove him from the building. Celeste did not accept what had happened as the end of the story, because she had not built what she had built by accepting endings that someone else had written. Within 40 minutes of the ballroom clearing, her communications director had drafted a statement positioning the events as a hostile financial action by a former industry figure with a personal grievance and enough residual contractual leverage to engineer a disruption for negotiating advantage. Grant Kingsley arrived at the tower by car within the hour, moving with the urgency of a man whose family name was on a building currently appearing on every financial newswire in the country. And he brought 2 outside attorneys who spent their first 40 minutes trying to identify a procedural mechanism that could suspend or override the guarantor's authority in the period before the audit commenced. They found nothing, because Nolan had not improvised the authority he used. He had designed the clause himself, tested it against 3 rounds of legal review, and written it with the specific intention that it could not be short-circuited by the parties it was designed to govern. Grant authorized an offer of $100 million to be transferred within 24 hours to whatever account Nolan named in exchange for a written withdrawal of the material violation notice. The offer was conveyed through Audrey Lane, who delivered it by phone, and Nolan declined before she had finished reading the terms. Celeste had meanwhile instructed her research team to compile everything publicly available about Nolan Pierce's professional history, expecting to find a man whose career had ended in failure or scandal. What they found instead was a professional record that stopped being public roughly 6 years earlier. A risk management architect whose systems had been adopted by dozens of financial institutions across North America, who had built Cedar Gate as an independent vehicle so that the guarantee infrastructure he created could not be acquired or captured by the entities it was meant to oversee, and who had resigned his operating position following his wife's illness, divesting most of his equity holdings but retaining the Cedar Gate trustee role under governance documents that explicitly prohibited the position from being bought out or vacated while any guaranteed facility was under active review. Sophie called during the period when the Kingsley legal team was preparing its counter-strategy, and Nolan stepped into a stairwell to answer. And she asked whether he had eaten anything since lunch. And he said he would have something later, and she told him that was not an answer, and he said it was the best answer he had, and that he loved her and would be home when this was finished. He returned to the hallway to find that Preston had spent the previous 90 minutes remotely clearing archived email records from the document management system and replacing several internal memos with versions that attributed the original directive to restructure the collateral valuations directly to Celeste, and Nolan cross-referenced the deletion timestamps against the backup transmission he had secured before his credentials were suspended, and understood for the first time that this had never been careless ambition alone. Someone inside the company had deliberately engineered a collapse, arranged to take what they needed first, and intended to step aside and let the structure fall on everyone else. The transfer record confirmed it. Red Hollow Holdings had moved $340 million into a discretionary family trust in the 12 hours immediately before the closing ceremony, timed to clear before the audit would have made it visible. And the trust receiving those funds belonged to Preston Harrow. Nolan and Audrey worked through the night in a borrowed conference room at Whitcomb National Bank. And by 3 a.m. they had reconstructed nearly 4 years of the machinery Preston had built inside Kingsley Dominion. The mechanism had several interlocking parts, each designed to be unremarkable in isolation. Preston had arranged for Red Hollow Holdings to acquire specific Kingsley Dominion properties at below-market rates through transactions approved during quarters when Celeste's attention was on acquisitions elsewhere, then structured leaseback arrangements that caused Kingsley to pay escalating rent to a landlord that was, in functional terms, Preston himself, and simultaneously recorded those leased assets as owned properties in the collateral schedules submitted to lenders, creating the appearance of an asset base significantly larger than what actually existed on the company's balance sheet. He had run this structure across 17 separate assets over 44 months, using the inflated representations to access credit that would not otherwise have been available, and had used a portion of that credit to fund the acquisition now frozen, meaning that, had the deal closed, the fraud would have been embedded inside a transaction so large that unwinding it would have cost more than revealing it, and Preston would have completed his exit before anyone looked. Nolan laid all of it out in a document by 4 a.m. and then sat quietly before adding the section he had been avoiding, which was the section about Celeste. She had not designed the fraud, and she had not known the specific mechanics of what Preston had built with Red Hollow. But 3 years prior, she had sent him an internal message, preserved in the backup repository Nolan had secured before his credentials were suspended, directing him to make the leverage ratios presentable ahead of the syndication approval, a phrase ambiguous enough to mean many things but specific enough, given what followed, to indicate that she had asked for favorable numbers without asking carefully how they would be produced. She had not committed fraud in the legal sense that attached to Preston, but she had chosen not to ask the question whose answer might have forced her to stop, and she had signed the personal certification knowing she had not verified what she was certifying. Nolan drove to Kingsley Dominion headquarters the following morning and found Celeste in the boardroom already, sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He sat across from her without preamble, and she asked him directly what exactly he wanted from this. He slid a printed list across the table, not a demand, but a page of names. Department heads, regional managers, logistics coordinators, data center technicians, warehouse workers who moved the company's goods through the night in facilities whose operating credit was now suspended. He told her he had not locked Kingsley Dominion to destroy it. The lock had prevented Preston from completing the withdrawal that would have left the company unable to meet payroll by the end of the month. She looked at the list for a long time. He gave her 2 options. Open the books entirely, accept the restructuring the consortium required, and participate in repairing what had been damaged, or allow the 40 banks to proceed with a full covenant default review, which would almost certainly result in the family losing operational control of everything. She said she needed to know whether he had come there to take the company. He said no. What he had come for was the same thing he came for when he first arrived in the basement, to look at something that was not adding up and make sure it did not hurt the people it was going to hurt. The formal review session was convened the following morning in Kingsley Dominion's main boardroom, with representatives of all 40 institutions joining by secure video connection, and 3 members of the Independent Audit Committee seated in person alongside Audrey Lane's team. Grant Kingsley arrived early and spent the period before the session began in a conversation with outside counsel that left him looking like a man who had just received confirmation of something he had hoped would not be confirmed. He attempted, when the session opened, to characterize the preceding events as a hostile external action directed at a legacy family enterprise by someone using a contractual technicality to settle a personal grievance. But Audrey Lane interrupted him at the second sentence and said the session was a covenant review, not a discussion of motivation, and that the material before the committee would reach its own conclusions. Nolan presented the evidence in the sequence it had been developed. The duplicate collateral identifiers, the Red Hollow Holdings transaction ledger tracing the flow from a Kingsley subsidiary through the shell structure to Preston's family trust, the audio capture of Preston directing a junior document manager to purge the archived correspondence, the sequence of flags Nolan had submitted through the document oversight system over the preceding weeks, and the footage of Celeste signing the personal certification after being verbally warned in front of witnesses. Preston's outside counsel attempted at 3 separate points to redirect the discussion toward Celeste's internal directive, but each time the committee returned to the documents, and the documents did not redirect. Preston was asked to leave the room before the session concluded, and when he stepped into the corridor, 2 federal investigators were waiting, and the room was very quiet when the door closed behind him. The committee deliberated for less than 2 hours before reaching a position. The banks would not call the full facility default, an action that would have forced immediate asset liquidation and almost certainly ended thousands of jobs, provided that Kingsley Dominion agreed to a supervised restructuring under an independent governance framework. Nolan presented 4 conditions on behalf of the lending consortium: that Celeste step back from the CEO role for the duration of the restructuring, that the board be expanded to include a majority of independent directors approved by the audit committee, that the personal assets of the Kingsley family trust bear a partial subordinated claim covering the period of the collateral misrepresentation, and that employee wages, benefits, and payroll obligations be classified as senior priority ahead of any distribution to family shareholders during the restructuring period. The chairman of the audit committee indicated the consortium's acceptance before the room had finished absorbing the terms. Grant Kingsley stared at the table. Celeste, sitting 3 seats from him, had been quiet since the video evidence played. The document was slid across the table to her, and before she signed, she looked at Nolan and asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question, in a voice she had not used in a room like this one in years, whether he planned to take the company from her. He said no. She signed. Under the guarantee agreement's default provisions, Cedar Gate Trust held the right to convert its first loss position into an equity stake in Kingsley Dominion sufficient to constitute a controlling interest, a clause that Celeste's legal team had reviewed 3 years prior and assessed as a remote technical provision unlikely ever to be triggered, because triggering it required exactly the kind of catastrophic covenant failure that responsible management was designed to prevent. Every member of the board assumed this was the mechanism Nolan had been building toward from the moment he identified the first irregularity in the basement, because it was the mechanism that would have made everything he had endured make sense in the vocabulary of power that the people in that room spoke fluently. He let them assume it for a day. Then he convened a session with the independent directors and the audit committee and disclosed his intention. Cedar Gate Trust would exercise its conversion rights and immediately transfer the resulting equity stake into a newly formed employee ownership fund, structured so that the workers of Kingsley Dominion from the warehouse technicians to the regional operations managers, would collectively hold a meaningful shareholder position in the company they had spent years building. Nolan retained only a temporary voting proxy on behalf of the fund, to be exercised solely on matters related to the restructuring until a permanent governance committee could be elected from within the employee base. He retained nothing for himself. The room was very still when he finished. One of the independent directors asked him why. He said the people on the list he had shown Celeste were the ones who had built the thing. It seemed reasonable that they should have a voice in what it became. The banks released the operating accounts within 48 hours. The payroll funds, the supplier payments, the facility maintenance budgets, restoring the daily functioning of all 38 sites, while the acquisition funds remained locked pending the full audit. Kingsley Dominion lost the Westbridge deal, and with it the headline Celeste had rehearsed for 3 years, but the company survived the week intact and solvent. On the afternoon the payroll accounts reopened, Celeste walked out of the building for the first time, without a communications team surrounding her, stood in front of the cameras that had gathered since the previous evening, and gave a statement she had written herself. She said she had built her career on the belief that a person's value was measured by the positions they held, the assets they commanded, and the rooms they were permitted to enter. She said she had been publicly wrong about that, and specifically wrong about the person who had tried to protect her from a collapse she had not allowed herself to see. She said she was sorry. In the lobby behind her, visible through the glass to the cameras outside, several members of the logistics team and the document department, people who had stood in that ballroom and heard Celeste call Nolan worthless, were watching through the window. Nolan was not among them. He had already left for the evening. 6 months later, Kingsley Dominion operated under an independent board with a governance structure unrecognizable to the version of the company that existed the night of the announcement. The family's luxury assets, the corporate aircraft, the penthouse hospitality suites, the private dining accounts, had been sold to meet the restructuring obligations rather than eliminated from the workforce, a reversal that surprised the analysts who had expected the opposite. The Employee Ownership Fund had become the second largest shareholder in the company, with an elected governance committee attending every board meeting, exercising its voice twice already to prevent cost reductions that would have fallen disproportionately on frontline workers. The 40 institutions had begun restoring the full credit facilities in stages, having verified that each asset in the collateral portfolio now corresponded to a single, accurately valued, uniquely pledged property. Nolan declined the permanent board role offered at the conclusion of the restructuring and accepted instead a temporary supervisory designation that ran until the independent governance was fully established, and then he returned to his regular hours, the hours that had always been the actual reason he had chosen not to remain in the rooms where people like him were expected to stay. Celeste had no escort, no executive floor, and no communications team preparing her words before she spoke them. She worked in a standard conference room on the 9th floor, reviewing contracts she had previously delegated without reading, attending operational meetings she had previously considered beneath her attention, and learning with some difficulty the texture of a company she had commanded for years without ever fully understanding. On the morning the final audit clearance was issued, Nolan came to the building for one last session. The manager who had once directed him to stand near the service corridor during the announcement event was waiting at the lobby entrance and held the elevator door without being asked and pressed the correct floor without being told. In the boardroom, the Employee Governance Committee had taken the seats around the table, and when the session chair offered Nolan the chair at the head of the room, he carried it to the far end of the table, and placed it in the position designated for the fund's representative. The screen at the front of the room displayed the notification from the consortium's audit authority. 40 bank review completed. Kingsley Dominion cleared for responsible operations. Celeste looked across the table at him and said she had spent her entire professional life believing that a person's worth was measured by what they controlled. He said that was the wrong measure. Worth, he said, was not what a person took when they had the power to take it. It was what they chose to protect when no one in the room believed they had the standing to make that choice. He gathered his papers, shook hands with the committee members, and walked out of the building in the same twice-altered suit he had worn the day he first arrived. This time, no one in the lobby called after him, and no one in that room would ever again make the mistake of calling him worthless.